By some estimates, by the end of this century, Sandy-like flooding could occur as often as every 5 to 10 years.
Which of our economic activities are potentially vulnerable to climate change?
We're looking at wetter wets and drier dries.
That as people work on adaptation to climate change, that's actually one of the best ways to motivate people.
I'm seeing a lot of really bright people working on these problems.
Good evening. I'm Michael Catania, the Executive Director of Duke Forums, and I would like to welcome you to the first in a series of conversations about major environmental issues. We hope that these Duke Forum dialogues will help people become more informed on environmental issues and to learn about what they can do to help us build a more sustainable world. We have chosen the first topic tonight, adapting to climate change, for a number of reasons. First, it's hard to go a day right now without hearing some major announcement on climate change. Second, I think we believe climate change is arguably the issue that will have one of the biggest impacts, both economically and environmentally, on future generations. So it's something that we think is important for people to learn about. We also know that there is, despite public opinion polls that show that people are very concerned about climate change, there is no political consensus to take any decisive action. And it leaves a lot of people wondering whether this is just an issue that demands immediate attention because we're approaching a tipping point, or it's just a natural phenomenon that nobody really needs to be concerned about. So we're going to really kind of dig down a little deeper into that this evening. As you know, there's been a lot of attention from a lot of sources recently on this issue. We had a report from the United Nations panel on climate change, as well as a recent report by two former secretaries of the U.S. Department of Treasury called Risky Business. So there does seem to be a growing consensus that the time to act is now, and that postponing that action will only make the consequences more dire and the cost even higher. So this evening, we'd like to really explore that and help people to form their own opinions. To help us answer that question tonight, we're delighted to have two genuine experts on climate change. Dr. Robin Leichenko and Dr. Anthony Broccoli, who are the co-directors of the Rutgers Climate Institute. Both Robin and Tony have worked on climate issues for many, many years. They've published extensively, and so they are genuine experts. So I'd like to ask Robin to start us off with your presentation, and Tony will go next, and then we'll go to questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is some of the kind of global and broad issues with respect to climate change impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. I'm just going to begin by drawing your attention to a couple of reports that Michael has already mentioned. Well, one of them that he mentioned, this is the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was the Working Group 2 report, which was released in March, which does a global assessment of the potential impacts and vulnerabilities to climate change, as well as what we know about adaptation. The other report that I want to just mention is the United States National Climate Assessment Report that was released in May. What these two reports have in common is that they both were conducted over a number of years, and they had hundreds of scientists working on the two of them, and both of them are an attempt to kind of give a state-of-the-art assessment, a consensus assessment about what we know about climate change impacts, both globally and what we know about the United States. I'll also pull a little bit from my own research on climate change impacts in New Jersey. So just turning to these two reports and the consensus, this is from the IPCC, the consensus. This consensus point that the impacts of climate change are already visible. Climate change is essentially already happening and having widespread impacts. This is an iconic image of the Arctic, which we all have seen, and we've all sort of thought about climate change in terms of its effect on the Arctic. But one of the major points from the IPCC report is that climate change is having visible impacts in every region of the world, on every continent, in every ocean. It's affecting physical systems, ecological systems, and human systems in all regions. This is also true in the United States. The report of the U.S. National Climate Assessment makes this same point, that the impacts of climate change within the United States are already visible, and they're visible in every single region. I just pulled this one particular graphic out to show you, because I think this graphic makes a point that I think those of us in the Northeast have already experienced. This idea that we're having much more of our precipitation occurring in the form of heavy precipitation events. So this is comparing the most recent 50 years with the 50 years prior, and how much of our precipitation falls in the form of very heavy events. And as we know in New Jersey, very heavy events mean localized flooding, they mean damage to roads, they mean damage to various types of infrastructure, damage to homes, and so forth. So this is a significant visible impact of climate change. Within New Jersey, climate change is also visible, and there's also evidence. This is actually a graph that I had one of my students put together when I was starting out a project looking at economic vulnerabilities to climate change in the Ocean County and Barnegat Bay region. And I was floored when I saw this graphic, because I don't think I'd really conceptualized how much the climate has changed in New Jersey and how much this significant trend of temperature rise. We can see it in our own research. We can also see, and this is something that we heard a lot from our stakeholders, the trend in New Jersey of increasing numbers of high precipitation events, increasing numbers of days where we have rainfall over 2 inches. And again, a result, I was fairly astonished, and these results that both of them repeat for the seasons, and I think Tony will give us more details about that in his presentation. So essentially the point is climate change is happening, it's happening already. And then we turn to the question of vulnerability. That's another major concern with respect to climate change. Which sectors are most vulnerable to climate change? Which regions are most vulnerable? These questions, we can ask these on a global scale. That's what the IPCC was doing. So it pinpointed things like the Arctic as a globally vulnerable area, which I already mentioned. It also pinpointed in particular cities and urbanized coastal regions worldwide as being highly vulnerable. And of course, we know ourselves in New Jersey, that categorization certainly applies to us. With respect to vulnerability, another major and very important question is who's vulnerable? So on a worldwide basis, when we think about vulnerabilities, one of the major populations that comes out are those living in poverty. Climate change is a force that can exacerbate the numbers of people living in poverty. Poverty also makes you much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. You may tend to live in an area that's much more likely to be damaged by extreme events. You also may be dependent on a sector like agriculture. That's a sector that's much more on the front lines of climate change impacts. You also are living with perhaps in much more marginal circumstances with respect to food, and one of the consequences of climate change that's already been documented is rising food prices, and that's certainly a projected effect for the future. So those are all effects, and when we think globally about populations at risk, among the many populations, that's a population that gets focused on quite a bit. Turning to New Jersey, we also have the same question. What are our vulnerabilities? Which sectors in New Jersey are most vulnerable? Which regions are most vulnerable? Which populations? In New Jersey, we have extensive property at risk. This was, in my own research, we were asking stakeholders about critical assets in coastal New Jersey, critical assets at risk, and we can think about, you name it, we have roads, we have bridges, we have infrastructure, we have all of the tourism infrastructure, we have hundreds of billions of dollars, at least, in real estate property that's at risk, and I'll show a graphic of that in a moment. We also, in New Jersey though, it's not simply our assets that when we think about what's at risk and what's exposed, but we also have to think about our activities. Which of our economic activities are potentially vulnerable to climate change and to the impacts of climate change? Some of the activities that were highlighted in our research were commercial fishing, tourism, agriculture, among the many, and of course all the infrastructure sectors, the energy infrastructure sector, the water infrastructure, the sectors I've already mentioned, both the assets of those sectors and the performance and activities of those sectors. Those are also some of our critical vulnerabilities. But it's not simply the structures and the economic activities that we need to think about, but we also need to think about the people. Who's at risk in New Jersey? And on a global scale, I already mentioned poverty as an issue, and certainly that's an issue in New Jersey, and populations in poverty tend to be more at risk for a number of reasons. But in addition to those populations, we also saw with Hurricane Sandy how extensive our vulnerability is with respect to middle-income homeowners. So that's another whole population that's at risk in New Jersey. In addition, small business owners were a population that came out quite a bit in our research, as particularly small business owners dependent on tourism in the coastal regions as critically vulnerable to potential impacts. The elderly also came out, health compromised populations, other populations that came out as being highly at risk. One more slide on this one. This was just a slide illustrating property value at risk in at risk to sea level rise in coastal New Jersey. This is based on some research that one of my graduate students is working on along with a larger research team, where we're trying to simply quantify exposure to, or the potential for exposure to sea level rise. How much property do we have at risk? We're sort of asking that question. How much property is at risk? How much of our tax base is at risk? And then kind of adding that up and quantifying it over the different counties. And just one number in here, if I point out, it's just in thinking about Ocean County, which was the county we focused on, most extensively, even 1 meter of sea level rise means $14 billion in property value at risk, over $200 million in municipal tax exposure. So this isn't damages to from sea level rise. This is what's potentially exposed to damage from sea level rise. And when we have that, these are just 4 of our counties, and all of our counties have potential exposures. So there's a question of impacts, there's a question of vulnerability, and then we turn to the question of adaptation. Adaptation means taking an action to reduce the impacts of climate change, doing something to put yourself out of harm's way, perhaps building a building stronger to make the building less likely to be damaged. Adaptation can also be doing things to take advantage of the possibilities of climate change. So a farmer switching crops to a crop that may be more heat tolerant would also be an adaptation. Adaptation strategies range from, every different sector has its own strategies, every different sector has possible ways to adapt. Adaptation, as with the impacts of climate change, we're already seeing adaptation to climate change. One of the points from the IPCC report about adaptation, and this is also echoed in the National Climate Assessment, is to start thinking about climate change as a risk management issue. This is also the Risky Business Report proposes this framework, that climate change is another risk that we're dealing with. It's similar to the types of, we deal with financial risks, we deal with health risks, we deal with a whole variety of risks in our society, and climate change is another risk that we need to think about how to manage and plan for. One of the findings from the climate change research in particular, though, with respect to adaptation, is that adaptation has to be region specific. It has to be tailored to the regional context, it has to work with a local context. It has to work politically, it has to work culturally, it has to work economically. And so thinking about adaptation in New Jersey, it's really a question of what are the opportunities for adaptation in New Jersey, given the various constraints that we have, given our municipal structure, given our financial constraints. And I think of these as constraints or the challenges. And I think one of the great things about the New Jersey Adaptation Alliance is the possibility of helping to identify all the different opportunities that we have for adaptation to climate change. And also really thinking about how to overcome the challenges, because the challenges are really where the devil is in the details, and sorting out what we can do and how we can get things accomplished. And I feel very hopeful with the work of the Adaptation Alliance in moving that forward. Then just a final point with respect to the IPCC is the idea that really adaptation gives us a lot of opportunities to do things more sustainably. It gives us opportunities to do things that we might want to do anyway. And if we can make adaptation dovetail with some of our broader societal goals, adaptation is going to have a much more likely possibility of being effective and being sort of feasible in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Tony?
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and talk a little bit about climate change in New Jersey. And my message at heart is really a simple one. Climate change, it's real, it's happening now, and it's affecting New Jersey. And what I'll try to do is show you some of the ways in which it's happening and what its effects on New Jersey are and will be. I'll begin with the global perspective. This is an image that we've seen probably in many forms from time to time, showing how global temperatures have varied over about the last 135 years or so. From year to year, the temperatures can go up and down quite a bit. But when we look at this long-term century perspective, we get a sense for how there has been a rise in temperature, gradual, in the early part of the 20th century, flattening out a little bit from the 1940s through the 1960s, and then rising more rapidly since about 1970. This graph is labeled in degrees Celsius, but if I convert it to degrees Fahrenheit, it's telling us the world has warmed by about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century or so. That may not sound like a lot, but to put it in perspective, the Earth was only about 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit colder 20,000 years ago when we were at the peak of the last ice age. So when we talk about global temperature changes of even a few degrees Fahrenheit, these are large changes. When we look at what's going on in New Jersey, we see a somewhat similar pattern. The variations from year to year are larger in New Jersey because it's a smaller area. It's affected more by what the jet stream is doing in a particular year. But over the last 100 years, the warming has averaged a little more than 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That warming has been more rapid since 1980. We've had the 3 warmest years ever in over 115 years of records since 1998, and 2012 was the warmest year on record in New Jersey. If we break that down between winter and summer, and in this graph, winter is on the left and summer is on the right, the temperature rise in winter has been even more rapid. It's been over 3.5 degrees per 100 years. In summer, a little bit smaller, about 2.5 degrees per 100 years. In the winter, it can sometimes be harder to see these trends because the variations in temperature from year to year are much larger in the winter than they are in the summer. For instance, we have a very fresh memory of what seemed like a cold winter in this past winter. Well, that's the last dot in the diagram on the left. And if you notice, that dot is just below the gray line. The gray line is the average temperature for the 20th century. Last winter seemed cold, but compared to the average winter in the 20th century, it wasn't very cold at all. It just seemed very cold because of this warming trend that has been underway over the past several decades. Now, increases in temperature have particular impacts on temperature extremes. We call it global warming for a reason, because the impacts on temperature are one of the most robust and one of the most prominent effects of climate change. This diagram is a little busy. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but time runs from left to right with 1895 on the left and 2013 on the right. Then from top to bottom are the calendar months from January to December. So it's a little grid with each month in the last 118 years represented. The boxes are colored in if that month was one of the 5 warmest or the 5 coldest months for that particular calendar month. So the blue colors are the top 5 coldest months. The red colors are the top 5 warmest months. When you look at this graph, it's impossible not to notice that the blues are concentrated towards the left and the reds are concentrated towards the right. Of the 60 months that were in the top 5 for each of the calendar months, 41 of the coldest occurred before 1930, and 32 of the warmest have occurred since 1990. Since the millennium began, since 2000, there have been 25 warm months and only 2 cold months. So we've definitely seen a swing towards more warm extremes and fewer cold extremes. Projecting this forward, this is from a research paper that came out several years ago in which the authors posed and answered the question, in the future, how many summers are going to be warmer than what would today qualify as the warmest summer on record? The yellow colors, orange colors, and red colors are upwards of 50%, 70%, and 90%. Here in New Jersey, by mid-century, under a high-emission scenario, 70% of the summers will be warmer than what would today constitute a record. And by the end of the century, 90% of the summers are going to be warmer than anything we've seen so far. Putting that in a different perspective, this is from the national assessment that Robin referred to. This graph shows the number of 90-degree days. In New Jersey, in the late 20th century, that might have ranged from about 10 per year in northwestern New Jersey to maybe 20 or 25 in southeastern New Jersey. Under a high emission scenario, we expect to look at as many as 40 to 60 90-degree days per summer by the last few decades of this century. Robin talked a little bit about the impacts on precipitation and the flooding that results from it. In New Jersey, we have seen an upward trend in average precipitation, but that trend is relatively small. The variations are dominated more by differences from decade to decade. Those of us, like me, old enough to remember the 60s, remembers the drought years during that period. That's where the green line dips down just to the right of the center of the diagram. Then the 70s were wet. The last decade has also been wet. But a lot of that is natural variability. Rainfall can vary a lot from year to year and from decade to decade. But it's not the changes in the average rainfall that we think are going to be most important, but the changes in the extremes. And this chart shows the fraction of the northeastern United States that's had above normal amounts of precipitation coming from extreme rain events. And over the past couple of decades, that area has more than doubled. This graph Robin already showed you, showing how the amount of rain that comes from these heavy rain events has been increasing very rapidly, particularly in the northeastern part of the country. Now, some of these variations from region to region may be just amplified by the natural variations in rainfall, but there is a dominant trend that's being seen worldwide of heavy rains becoming heavier. We expect that trend to be continuing through the future. These are projections under a high emission scenario of what the change will be in the wettest 5-day period in any given year. You see the map is almost entirely blue because everywhere in the world, regardless of whether the average rainfall goes up or the average rainfall goes down, the amount of intense rain is expected to increase. And here in New Jersey, it increases at a relatively large rate compared to other parts of the world. But at the same time, dry spells may lengthen. The areas in the warm colors here, the yellows, the oranges, and the reds, are places where there will be more strings of dry days in the future. And you can imagine the impacts that will have on water supply. For water supply, we'd like the precipitation to be as even and uniform as possible. And instead, we're looking at wetter wets and drier dries. But perhaps the most important impact of climate change in New Jersey, and one that Robin has already alluded to with her statistics on property vulnerability, is sea level rise and the impacts of sea level rise. On the coastal plain at Cape May, Sandy Hook, and Atlantic City, sea level in New Jersey has been rising steadily over the past century. At Atlantic City, where the records go back more than 100 years, we've seen about 17 inches of sea level rise over the course of the century. That's happening because at the same time the ocean water is going up, the land is also subsiding. The subsidence of the land, the sinking of the land, has nothing to do with climate change, but the rise in the ocean does. And the fact that our land here in New Jersey is subsiding makes New Jersey more vulnerable than other parts of the world to the effects of sea level rise. This rise in sea level has also been accelerating. If we look at it globally for the past 100 years, it's averaged about 1.7 millimeters per year, about 2/3 of an inch per year. But over the last 20 years, satellite measurements show that that rate has increased to 3.2 millimeters per year, or about 1.1 inches per year, not quite double what we saw over the century as a whole. My colleagues at Rutgers, sea level experts Ken Miller, Bob Kopp, Ben Horton, have recently published a paper in which they've estimated that sea level in New Jersey on the coastal plain may rise an additional 1.5 feet or so by the middle of this century and 3.5 feet by the end of the century. Those are the best estimates. There's a range of estimates because it depends on future emission rates of carbon dioxide and also how rapidly the big ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica respond to climate change. When we think of sea level rise, we think of the impacts that occur when we have big coastal storms. And certainly Sandy, having happened so recently and having affected so many people here in New Jersey, is something that's very prominent in our minds when we think about the effects of sea level rise. One question that I get asked a lot is, will hurricanes and nor'easters affecting the New Jersey coast become more intense and more frequent? It turns out this is a tough question to answer. As a scientific community, this is something we're actively studying, but we don't think we have the answer pinned down yet. But the answer to that question may not be as important as it seems, because the real 800-pound gorilla in the room is the fact that sea level is rising. And when sea level rises, it raises the baseline for coastal flooding, increasing the risk of floods comparable to what we saw from Hurricane Sandy. By some estimates, by the end of this century, Sandy-like flooding could occur as often as every 5 to 10 years. So instead of being the rare event that it's been only once in the last 100 years, we could see it much more often. So to summarize climate change in New Jersey, the most dramatic effects are more warm extremes and fewer cold extremes, heavy rainfall events becoming more intense, but at the same time more frequent dry spells, and that rising sea levels will increase the frequency and intensity of coastal flooding. So, Michael, thanks again for the opportunity to talk about this, and I look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you, Tony. Well, you and Robin have certainly presented some sobering information that suggests that this all is all too real, and it is time to decide what to do about it. But I also sense a tone of optimism that there are things that can be done. So maybe in some of the questions we can get at that. But I'd like to start the questions with a few of my own. The first one I'd like to ask is, does it matter whether climate change is being caused by man-made activities or it's a natural phenomenon? And if so, why?
The most basic and fundamental answer is that if it's a result of human activities, as we think most of it is, that means we do, in principle, have the ability to control how much change happens in the future. The problem is certainly going to be with us because our dependence on fossil fuel energy means we're emitting a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But whether the problem is manageable or whether the problem becomes unmanageable then depends on what our future emissions are. It also matters because if we didn't know why it was happening, we wouldn't have as much confidence that it's going to continue into the future.
I see. So you both talked about climate change as a series of erratic patterns, not just warming, but really truly more violent weather, more frequent storms, things like that. So I'd like to ask you, did scientists and the environmental community make a strategic error in talking about this as global warming for so long, which seemed to let people kind of poo-poo this because we were having worse winter storms and snow and things like that? And they said, well, see, obviously we're not having global warming, we're having snow in October. So was that a strategic error? And if so, what should we do about that?
When I use the terms, I use them interchangeably. One reason to perhaps prefer the term global warming is that the direct effect of adding these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is to warm the Earth. But then that, in turn, has a lot of other consequences. When we talk about climate change, that's what we're trying to do, embrace the fact that it means more than just changes in temperature, but also these changes in rainfall, changes in the variability of rain, more heavy rain, more frequent dry spells, and that there may be other changes associated with that as well. But I think it's important when we think about these cold events like the relatively cold winter we had, to remember that because climate change is happening, that doesn't mean that weather isn't going to happen anymore. And that the main driver of these variations is weather, is the fact that some years the jet stream brings us cold air, other years it brings us warm air. But as the climate changes, those cold years may not be as cold, and the warm years will be warmer.
I'd like to throw it open a little bit and ask some of our guests in particular, Governor Florio is here with us tonight. He serves as one of the 2 honorary co-chairs to the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance, along with Governor Kane.
I was curious about your statement about subsidence. What is the cause of the subsidence?
So the governor asked, what is the cause of the subsiding or sinking land here in New Jersey? And to the best that we can explain it, there are 2 main causes. For one of them, we have to go back and look 20,000 years ago when the Ice Age was occurring, and from northern New Jersey north across Canada, there was ice 2 or 3 miles thick. The weight of that ice pressing down on the Earth's crust pushed it down into the squishy underlying mantle region of the Earth. When it pushed it down there, the mantle kind of squeezed up around the edges of the ice sheet, including along the New Jersey coast. Like if you push on one part of a toothpaste tube, it's going to bulge up somewhere else. Now that the ice is gone, the crust is returning to where it was when it didn't have that weight on it. But that process, even though it may not seem intuitive that it would be this way, that process takes thousands and thousands of years. So that's responsible for probably more than half of the subsidence that's happening in New Jersey. But along the New Jersey coast, we also have a lot of loose sediments that are also associated with the effects of the Ice Age. And as time goes on, those sediments are compacted. That may be accelerated a little bit by the fact that we withdraw groundwater from aquifers in the coastal plain, and that also contributes a little bit to the subsidence.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Senator Kip Bateman if he has a question.
Well, let me thank you both for a very informative presentation. I have it's a 2-part question, but what can we do here in New Jersey to lower our vulnerability to the worst impacts of climate change and to really adapt to a climate change? Are there specific things we as a state can do? And I guess as a follow-up question, what can individuals do to respond to the climate change?
With respect to the state, or in general, what we can do, one of our major vulnerabilities, as we've already talked about, is our vulnerability of where our property is and how our property is built. And so I think really focusing and addressing how much of our infrastructure is at sea level, how much of our infrastructure is almost immediately vulnerable to storms, and just even cataloging and documenting what's there and thinking about how can we modify our infrastructure, do we need to move roads, do we need to really ask big picture questions about how and where we're living, as well as how we want to move forward and how we can sort of come together in ways that are equitable in finding solutions.
For the second part of your question is that minimizing the impacts of climate change also involves trying to make the problem more manageable. And to the extent that most of us have the ability to reduce our carbon footprints in ways that don't necessarily decrease the quality of our lives, that can help make the problem more manageable. We will have to adapt, but the bigger the problem is, the harder it will be to adapt. And many of these changes represent win-win situations, because energy that we don't use is energy that we don't pay for. So that's another opportunity to do something that's good for more than one reason.
Thank you both. And as an observation, you would think right now, post-Sandy, would really be an opportunity for us to reevaluate what we've been doing, in particular at the Jersey Shore, and what we can do to change it to prevent what happened with Sandy in the future. So, but thank you both very much.
Senator, let me also add that tomorrow morning when you wake up, there will be available the recommendations of the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance. So hopefully there'll be some answers to your question in the recommendations in that report.
We look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Professor Rick Lathrop if he has a question.
As you mentioned, sea level rise seems to be one of the greatest threats to a coastal state like New Jersey. So maybe you could comment a little bit more about what you think is the most likely scenarios for sea level rise and possibly some of the adaptation options.
As I mentioned briefly when I was going through my slides, one of the issues with sea level rise is that we have relatively wide error bars, that our uncertainty, the range of conditions that we can expect, is still relatively broad, because it depends on how much more greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere and also how rapidly the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica respond to these changes. Most of you probably heard of the study that was released several weeks ago that indicated that one of the major glaciers in the Antarctic is now melting in an unstable manner. That doesn't mean it's going to disappear in 5 years, but we don't know if it's going to take decades or it's going to take centuries, but eventually that will lead to many feet of sea level change globally. I think in New Jersey, the middle of the range scenarios, maybe 1.5 feet by the middle of the century, 3.5 feet by the end of the century, represents a very significant set of coastal impacts that we'll need to adapt to.
And I guess in terms of adaptation, I think we can think about preparedness for more extreme storm events. So improving our emergency preparedness capacity, just so that people know that storms are coming, that they know that these storms are dangerous, and that they know to evacuate, and that they keep heeding the warnings to evacuate in the moment. So adaptation, partly it's really preparedness, but then also thinking about long-term strategies to deal with higher sea levels. Some of the things that are already happening, in some cases we're raising properties, in some cases we're deciding we're going to buy out this set of properties that's vulnerable, and we're going to just take it and shift it over to green space, various kinds of green infrastructure. So there's quite a lot of options for adaptation to sea level rise and extreme storms.
I understand we also have a high school environmental studies teacher in the audience, and I'd like to ask Bruce Tataker if he has a question.
Thank you, Michael. You mentioned, Dr. Leichenko, you mentioned that there are some opportunities with adaptation, things like crop switching or sustainable development when we're adapting. Are there other winners that are going to come out of the climate change equation here in New Jersey?
Well, I think we have a lot of opportunity for alternative energy. That's a huge adaptation opportunity. It's also an opportunity to mitigate climate change, in other words, to reduce our emissions to climate change. But many of the things that entail reductions of emissions, such as making buildings much more energy efficient and so forth. These are really options that, if you use green building techniques, for example, that you can reduce your vulnerability to extreme heat. And so there's quite a lot of options that I think could grow our economy as well as protect us from climate change.
Bruce, what are you hearing from your students on climate change?
I've actually seen a change. I've been teaching for 10 years now at Mendham High School. And 10 years ago, I faced a lot more skepticism in the classroom about climate change. And I think these days, the students are much more accepting of climate change, and I think more concerned about taking action and trying to do something about it.
Good to hear.
While I'm up here, if I could ask one more question. We've talked a lot about the economic impact of climate change here in New Jersey. Can you talk a little bit about the effect on ecosystems and species, maybe what we might be seeing in the future? Also, if some species might be winners and some might be losers, and how changing climate is going to shift the natural communities here?
Well, that's a question that I don't consider myself an expert on, but I'll provide a couple of examples that may be relevant, and these both happen to involve insect species. As you probably know, the pine bark beetle that has been affecting a lot of forests here in New Jersey has been spreading northward. This is an insect that cannot survive, its life cycle cannot survive extremely cold winter temperatures. Because we haven't had as many of those extremely cold winter temperatures in recent years, it's been able to extend its range further north. And that's something that we could expect to continue in the future. Of course, another area of concern are insects that transmit disease to humans, particularly mosquitoes that can transmit a variety of diseases. And again, many of them are sensitive to temperature. And as we see warming conditions, we may see some of those species extend further north. Now, maybe on a positive side, if you're thinking about growing certain kinds of crops in New Jersey where the growing season is maybe marginal and a longer growing season would be better, then the effects of climate change may be to lengthen the growing season. But if you're growing crops that require a certain amount of chilling in the winter, like cranberries, for instance, then global warming may have adverse effects on the ability to grow those crops.
I'll just add one thing with respect to the ecological impacts that we heard about in our interviews with stakeholders was a real concern for migratory bird habitat and loss of that migratory bird habitat, which is both an ecological impact as well as an impact on our, something we all value very much.
Bruce, I can tell you from personal, if perhaps anecdotal experience, I've been making maple syrup for the last 12 years. And one of the things that I've learned is that the range of sugar maple trees is moving northward so that my grandchildren may not be able to tap sugar maples. I've also noticed just in a 12-year period that I'm tapping almost a full month earlier, that the trees are responding to the warmer weather and the earlier spring-like weather by producing sap much earlier. I used to tap in the first week in March. Now I'm tapping in the first or second week in February. That seems to be an awful big change in 12 years. So, thanks. I'd like to throw it open to other members of the studio audience.
There's a great deal of debate at the Jersey Shore whether dunes actually do protect homes and structures.
The question is about the effects of dunes and whether or not it's the height of the dunes or the width of the beach that matters more for protecting coastal areas. What I've heard from experts such as the group at Richard Stockton University that's been doing beach profiles up and down the New Jersey coast is that actually both things matter. That the places where there was a lot of damage during Sandy were places where the beaches were narrow and the volume of the dunes was not very great. So it's not just the height, it's also the height and the width, because basically what you're doing is allowing the storm's energy to be dissipated, washing that sand away instead of coming through and washing people's houses away. But there is an element of the coastal flooding problem that can't be solved by dunes, and that is along the barrier islands. There was a great deal of flooding on the bayshore sides, and that was simply water that entered the bays through the inlets, and the rise in that water level flooded houses, even though superficially those houses may have looked intact. So dunes will help with some of the actual destruction of houses by waves and surf, but they don't necessarily solve the problem of bayside flooding.
After decades of declining populations, some of our cities, many of our cities, have turned the corner and are actually starting to increase in population again. What special problems will the cities face from the impacts of climate change, and what should they be looking to do to maintain their viability?
One of the critical problems for cities is actually infrastructure, transport infrastructure in particular, and making sure that that transport infrastructure stays, stays sort of viable during storm events, that it quickly recovers after events. So I think making our transportation infrastructure more resilient is one of the critical steps for cities. Also protecting populations from things like heat, and heat island effect is also a tremendous issue in New Jersey. We already have a significant heat island effect. We already also have significant problems of asthma, which are concentrated in urban areas, more so than throughout the state. So I think thinking about health, sort of health warning systems, preparation for emergencies, I think is one of the big factors that will be important for high density urban areas.
Tony, you were just responding to a question about sea level rise, and you kind of offered an opinion on what the most likely range was. With that likely range, what does that do to cities in New Jersey, to the Jersey cities and Hobokens and Atlantic cities?
Well, many of those cities, I think, pose a special problem when it comes to sea level rise, because with higher density styles of living in those cities, you have buildings that aren't amenable to being put up on pilings to get them farther out of harm's way. And in a lot of those buildings, there's also vulnerable infrastructure that provides heat, air conditioning, power, et cetera, typically located in the lower levels of those buildings. So I think for cities like Hoboken and Jersey City and lower lying areas of other cities as well, sea level rise is a particular problem because it does increase the risk of flooding in these events. I think during Sandy, there were many people who didn't feel like they lived in places that were vulnerable to coastal flooding that discovered that they were. And that will be, of course, a greater problem with higher sea levels.
Governor Florio, if you could come up to the mic.
Urban areas have an extreme problem with regard to combined sewer outflows. There's 21 municipalities or regions in New Jersey that have these old-fashioned systems whereby sewage is treated in the same way that stormwater is. To the degree that that is combined, and it combines out of extreme weather events, what you're doing is increasing the problem, you're increasing outflows of sewerage untreated. And so there's lots of things we can do to adapt by getting some of that stormwater out of the sewer systems. Green roofs, all the types of open space areas within urban areas particularly. So I think that's something that we probably should be focusing on because the numbers are staggering. All of the sewage authorities are now starting to appreciate the fact that EPA has some regulations that they're trying to impose upon people. And if the plans are not developed for the removal of stormwater from sewage, the federal government is going to impose plans. So better that the towns that are affected go into their own planning in a cost-effective way. And I think that's going to be a major thing we'll be talking about.
One thing that I would mention is, as you alluded to, if we're looking at a future that includes more heavy rain events, these overflows typically happen during heavy rain events. And so designing systems that are capable of handling heavier rain events is going to be very important to reduce this problem in the future.
That's the definition of adaptation.
As sea level rises, cities are going to be increasingly more vulnerable to flooding, and as more of our rain comes in heavier rain episodes, will trigger the problem of combined sewer overflows sooner and more often. So that sounds like a serious issue that we need to address sooner rather than later. Tom Johnson from New Jersey Spotlight.
The state is currently almost finished rebuilding Route 35 along the coast, which was completely flooded out. And some groups have said that the state's not doing a good job allowing building to go in areas where it shouldn't be. I mean, what can the state do to prevent people from building in areas which have already experienced severe flooding problems? It's a problem that's been experienced in the Passaic River Basin for years. How are you going to get policymakers to think correctly about where building homes should be rebuilt and elsewhere?
Well, I think we had actually some nice examples of adaptation in the post-Sandy buyout programs that we've had. So we've had a number of towns, Sayreville in particular is one example, where they've actually bought out houses, incentivized property owners to agree to a buyout of their house on streets that were highly vulnerable and that have been repeatedly flooded, and that property will revert to open space. And so I think we actually have examples we're not maybe as ignorant about what we can do about this as we might assume. But there are constraints with trying to limit where property is located because of where, it's a state of many, many municipalities, each of which has a lot of say over what is built where. And so having collaboration and cooperation among municipalities and even regional cooperation in making some of those decisions, I think the state could facilitate that kind of cooperation and use some of the lessons of Sandy to move forward.
Doug O'Malley, Director with Environment New Jersey. I just wanted to thank you, Michael, for hosting this event, and thank Tony and Robin for summarizing so briefly some of their research, and also wanted to thank Tony for talking about the research from Rutgers on sea level rise. It really is an eye-startling number, and then also Robin's kind of analysis of talking about the business angle, and I think that's something that's having a lot of resonance. Hank Paulson's op-ed in this Sunday's New York Times on the need for aggressive business action, aggressive climate action in economic perspective was really eye-opening. But I'd love just to hear some additional thoughts from all the panelists on ways that there can be additional synergies between adaptation and mitigation, and then also additional partners that perhaps are kind of unexpected allies when we're talking about climate to help to really elevate this issue beyond just the environmental community.
With regard to adaptation and mitigation, I think that's something really in every single sector we could think about. Every sector where we're using energy gives us an opportunity to do something about mitigation. And then it's starting to think about where in the transit sector can we take steps to make ourselves more efficient as well as more resilient to extreme events. How can we adapt the sector? So I think it's really a question when you start to try to pinpoint what are specific opportunities for adaptation and mitigation. It's really a sort of, I think really it's more a sector by sector question and starting to think about what actions we can take.
For a while we were focused heavily on mitigation, and then we kind of made the jump to adaptation, and I think, as you suggest, the reality is we really probably need both approaches to truly prepare for this. And I'd like to ask Tony and Robin, is it too late to mitigate the impact of climate change? Do we have to go exclusively to?
I don't think it's ever too late, in the sense that the more greenhouse gases that find their way into the atmosphere, the larger the change in climate we expect to see. So it's, I think, very important not to view this as an either-or situation. Yes, the climate has already changed, and we're on a path that's going to lead to future changes, but smaller changes are more manageable than larger changes. So it's a mix of mitigation and adaptation that's probably going to be the most cost-effective path. I'm not an economist, but in the studies that I've read, that seems to be the conclusion, and that a lot of the questions that economists ask are, what is the optimal point where you get the most bang for your buck from mitigation and adaptation?
For a long while, Doug and many other people were talking about carbon offsets and restoring natural systems so they would absorb more carbon and hold more carbon as a way of mitigating and taking the edge off of some of the adverse effects. We don't hear as much about that as we used to. So that's probably a really good reminder. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Other questions? Eric Stiles from New Jersey Audubon.
Thank you, Michael, and for the presentations this evening. It was kind of alarming, sobering, and hopeful at the same time. When we look at the global theater, so we're focusing on New Jersey here, and Duke Farms is a kind of a model for what folks can do in a lot of different sectors. But we look at the United States as being a primary emitter of these greenhouse gas emissions. And I think there's a sense of chicken or egg. When you look at the growing economies of China and India and other developing nations, are there things that the United States can do to ensure that as we move forward, hopefully with the rules that were just proposed, that the rest of the globe will come with us? Or is waiting for that insurance kind of a race to the bottom? Should we follow Europe's example and just do the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do?
I think we should definitely take action on this and not assume that we need to wait to see action happening elsewhere. I think the United States is really in a position where countries are looking for leadership around climate change, around mitigation of climate change, around mitigation, really taking steps to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases that are driving climate change. So I think there's also, taking leadership also offers us an opportunity to take advantage of all these savings and all these cost savings with respect to energy that could be, that are out there that we are presently not really taking advantage of. So I see it as definitely a win-win for us to take leadership.
I think it's also important to keep in mind that because greenhouse gases remain in the atmosphere for a long time, it's not just what's being emitted now that matters, it's the cumulative amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the time that we started burning fossil fuels that matters. So yes, at today's rates, China has moved into the first place spot and the United States is now number 2. But when we think about cumulative emissions, the developing world has put more of the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere there. So this is where I think the diplomacy of dealing with climate change gets very complicated, because the developed world can say, well, we have to make sure that the growth in emissions is addressed in the developing world, but the developing world can turn around and say, but wait a minute, you had your chance already to use fossil fuels to grow your economy. We need to be on a level playing field. That's why I think this is a tough diplomatic question, but it is one that requires a global solution, and it is one that requires leadership.
Tony, is there any realistic possibility that China and India and other developing nations will take actions if the United States does not demonstrate that they're willing to do something?
Well, that's not something that I feel like I'm going to go out on a limb and comment on, but I do think one area that's really important is technology transfer, that some of the ways of mitigating the emissions of carbon dioxide involve implementing technology that can be used to reduce emissions. And in the developed world, we've developed a lot of technologies that are helpful in that regard. Trying to get the developing world to take advantage of those technologies is a potential path.
We've heard a lot of sobering information tonight, a lot of gloom and doom, but I'd like to close with one final question for the two of you. Is there anything, and if so, what is it, that makes you optimistic that we're going to respond to this crisis?
I guess I feel optimistic because I think public awareness is really starting to turn a corner on this issue. And I feel like we are seeing so much evidence that climate change is already happening that I think, when I started doing research in this area close to 20 years ago, it was really something in the far distant future. And I think there's so much recognition of the seriousness of the issue that I think that, to me, is really what's going to motivate action.
And I guess my optimism surrounds not only what Robin has mentioned, but also the very active research that's going on right now to try to develop alternative energy systems, to try to develop ways that might even allow us to use fossil fuels, but to extract the greenhouse gases from the chimneys and smokestacks before they find their way into the atmosphere. A lot of these technologies are not ready to go full tilt yet. There's going to be a lot of more research and more development that's required to make that happen. But I think it is happening. I'm seeing a lot of really bright people working on these problems.
Some of the evidence shows that as people work on adaptation to climate change, that's actually one of the best ways to motivate people to make changes that will actually reduce the problem, because they start to see how damaging the impacts are and how much it's going to cost to adapt, and they say, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Why don't we do something to just slow this problem down?
Well, I'd like to thank both of you very much for joining us this evening, as well as our live studio audience. We'll also be scheduling a follow-up conversation to focus on the recommendations that will be coming out from the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance. But for now, I'd like to thank the Alliance, as well as Greener New Jersey Productions, and the staff here at Duke Farms for putting this together, and for all of you coming out here this evening. And I very much hope we can continue this conversation both tonight and in days and weeks and months to come. Thank you very much.